So tonight, I'm just going to hand this off to Nick, but I just want to say a few words about Nick. He has joined MEIC, and his title is Energy Transition Advocate. He is a committed, passionate climate activist who showed up every day of the Public Service Commission rate case last year to provide testimony, to witness what the PSC was considering. We were really impressed by that type of commitment. And so when he applied for this job, we learned that he is also an industrial engineer. He just graduated from MSU last year in industrial engineering, and he has just a wonderful set of skills that we want to put to really good use, and so far so good. Anybody who knows Patrick Judge knows what a great advocate he was for energy related issues, and Nick is very much in that same vein, so we feel really fortunate to have him. He started full-time in September, and at that time we had been getting a lot of questions at MEIC about, well, how would you decarbonize our energy system? And frankly, we didn't, and internally didn't have the technical know-how or the time to do that type of task. So when Nick came on board, that was one of the first jobs that we asked him to do, was how would you consider decarbonization? We're not looking at numbers. We are looking at what are the systems in Montana, the energy systems that we need to address in order to reach our overall goal of zero carbon emissions, hopefully by 2030, but as soon as we possibly can. And Nick has been working on that ever since. And so tonight you're going to hear what his work has accomplished. And we urge you to ask questions. I just also want to say Nick has been spearheading our effort with the Public Service Commission, where yesterday we went forward with over 40 other businesses and faith groups and sportsmen and healthcare providers and so many other wonderful partners to ask the Public Service Commission to consider climate change in its regulation of electric and gas utilities. Nick has been spearheading that effort and did a great job yesterday in the press event. And pulling together not only the list of folks, but also all the attorneys and everybody who it took to lift that off the ground and launch it. So we'll hear a little bit more about that at the end if there's still time. But that's a really exciting, proactive initiative. And Nick has really done a wonderful job pulling it together, as has Katie. So with no further ado, I just want to introduce you to Nick. If you haven't met him yet, he's fantastic, and he's going to walk through what are the components of an energy transition.
Thanks, Anne, for that introduction, and excited to see you all on this call. I'll share my screen here and get started. Let's see. Can you see it? Wonderful. Yeah, so I'll just get right into it. So being our energy transition advocate, and now these days energy transition engineer is the recent title. It makes you wonder, what is the energy transition and why are we talking about it? And today I'm going to be walking us through kind of the structure of what decarbonizing Montana's energy system would look like. And there's a lot of pieces here, so bear with me. I'm going to try to keep it organized, but there's just so many things to cover. So to start off, I want to talk about the urgency of decarbonizing our energy. So as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, we are in a climate crisis. We have unprecedented levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere that are causing warming like we haven't seen at this rate in human history. And the primary driver of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are fossil fuels, specifically as burned for energy. But the exciting news is that we have technology readily available to switch out those fossil fuel energy sources while continuing to keep the lights on and keep a robust and reliable energy system. And that's what we're going to be looking at here today. So more specifically, what are we transitioning? So on a broad level, there's kind of a number of different parts of our energy system. We have our electricity, our electric grid, the transportation that's mostly on our highways and driving cars, industrial processes, and then residential and commercial heating and cooking. And currently, there are carbon-free sources in there, but we're very heavily reliant on fossil fuels of coal, methane gas, and petroleum to fulfill those needs. And what we're transitioning is fulfilling all those same functions, but with carbon-free renewable energy sources and looking further into how we do that effectively. And I want to talk about where Montana fits into the context of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So from a global perspective, this number is really hard to pin down, but anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 equivalent, is around 50 gigatons or 50,000 million metric tons every year. And estimates vary depending on how you do the calculation, but about 72% of those emissions are associated with energy. And if you look at the United States in particular, this graphic from the EPA shows point source emissions over, I believe, 25,000 metric tons annually. And this shows the United States, by the EPA's estimate, has about 6 gigatons or over 6,000 millimetric tons annually. And that percentage is also around that 75% of energy. And then Montana, if you go by the EPA's estimates, our slice of that is about 50 million metric tons, and it's with a more sparsely populated state, about 63% of that is energy. There's a big agricultural component. But if you look deeper into the numbers, you have to realize that Montana is also has influence regionally, nationally, as well as internationally as an exporter of both electric power and also those fossil fuels of coal, methane gas, and petroleum. And as was kind of explored in expert testimony at this summer's Helvey Montana trial, when you do some of the calculations to look specifically at all the emissions that Montana is responsible for in those exports and fossil fuels moving through the state, we get to a number of about 166 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, and that's CO2 specifically, not looking at methane or other emissions, and that's only for energy. So in Montana, we have a pretty outsized impact on emissions, and that's something we want to address. So further looking at where Montana fits into things, I want to look at how the energy emissions are split between different pieces. So electricity generation is going to be the biggest contributor of our energy emissions at 45%. Transportation is about 30%. Industrial processes, and we'll talk more about what that is, about 15%. And then heating and cooking, that's methane gas that is directly hooked up to homes and buildings for our appliances, is the last 10% there. So looking at where we are at currently, there's been a lot of issues and challenges. I'm sure most of you are aware of the expensive energy that we are purchasing in Montana. Northwestern Energy has been increasing rates astronomically, and they're just continuing to invest in expensive fossil fuels. And what we're hoping for and what we need in Montana is a system that's affordable, that's reliable, it's equitable, and carbon-free, and something that can be implemented immediately. The climate crisis is at our doorstep. We have only years and maybe a few decades at the most to get this right, and we need technologies that can start going into service right now. So when we talk about the transition, there's the current state of what our energy system is like. It's very fossil fuel dependent, but we're definitely have those pieces of carbon-free energy. And we're moving towards a final state of fully clean carbon-free energy that includes a number of efficiency measures as well as demand side management and other things, but being able to run the energy system entirely on carbon-free energy. And what's important to note is that current state we have and that final state that we're envisioning are both viable and technologically achievable, but the hardest part about getting there is the getting there. And I like this quote of this energy transition is like performing maintenance on a moving vehicle. The electric grid is, by some people's remarks, the largest machine ever built, and it's dynamic, it's always running, and it's a challenge to shift from the current fossil fuels to a future of fully clean energy while keeping everything running and affordable and reliable. And that's what this transition is all about. So what I'm going to dive into here is just a number of the components of this energy transition, and they all fit together. It's hard to say which comes before the other because it's interrelated. And we'll dive into these, but we're going to talk about energy electrification, demand side management and efficiencies, electricity decarbonization, transmission infrastructure, and then regional power sharing. And those are kind of these main topics that I've broken it out into. There's other related things, but to get an idea of what we're working with. And in all these efforts, I also wanted to touch on what the funding opportunities are. This is going to require investment to get this transition underway successfully. There's definitely there's expenses of building out this infrastructure, but it's also worth noting that there's also expenses of doing nothing and costs of the current damages caused by fossil fuels. But to really get these things underway, we need to have the right funding mechanisms. So a big one that has been on public attention and on people's radar is the Inflation Reduction Act from not this recent summer, but the one prior, that has lots of tax breaks, incentives, carrots that are encouraging clean energy development. I believe here I have just a screen grab from the Department of Energy of some of those tax credits that are available. There's also rebates. This isn't comprehensive, and I think we might be able to drop in the chat some links to more. I also know that the Department of Energy has a lot of resources, as well as the Rocky Mountain Institute and others locally in Montana. I know Climate Smart Missoula has a lot of resources around this. And this is part of it. There's a lot of other funding. There's also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is another federal funding opportunity. And there's also a lot of private investment because these technologies are becoming economically viable and they are really creating opportunities for people to jump on. So going to start off with this first piece, energy electrification. So jumping right in, I guess we'll look at this graph. This is from the New York Times, an article they had recently showing the current state of electricity and energy use in the United States. That graphic on the left shows total energy consumption in these different sectors. You can see the filled in portions are the amount that are currently electric, and the one on the right is showing the amount of those that in a certain projection would be needed to completely decarbonize the energy system. And you might be wondering why we need to electrify. And the big reason is that fossil fuel combustion for energy is going to inherently have greenhouse gas emissions. These are carbon-based fuels, and when you burn them, carbon dioxide and other pollutants go into the atmosphere. But what we know about electricity is that we can generate it in a number of ways, and whether it's carbon intensive or carbon free, it'll act the same. And we have at the ready viable clean electricity technologies that can be implemented in the time frame needed. So the idea is wherever possible, we can electrify our end use energy consumption so that we can then make that electricity clean and continue to run all our energy needs. And I'm going to talk about three main areas: transportation, industry, and then heating and cooking. So first off, transportation, and the one that is most kind of forefront in the media is electric vehicles. And that's a big part of transportation electrification, but there is more to the story. I would note that electric vehicles are great for a number of reasons. One being that powering our cars by gasoline and diesel is really an inefficient use of the energy stored in those fuels. But when you use electricity, that's just a much more efficient use for transportation. But the other pieces that we also need to look at are opportunities for public transportation and making that both accessible and also electrified. And then the final piece here is shipping and cargo and all these different vehicles that move our goods around. And we'll talk more about things that are the hard to abate sectors. I'm going to get to that, but some of these, especially aviation, are going to be really challenging things to address and make electric. But there's other ways that those can be decarbonized as we're looking at energy decarbonization. So then industry, I'm going to talk about what we have in Montana. So specifically, we have in Montana 4 petroleum refineries that collectively, by the EPA's numbers, contribute about 5% of total emissions in the state. These are 3 of them are located in Billings or in and around that area, and 1 in Great Falls. But these refine petroleum for fuels, but also for petrochemicals. So they can be challenging. There's a lot of processes that require direct heat in the refining process, and that can be electrified. But there's also other emissions that just need to be curtailed in other ways. And then the other big industry in Montana is cement production. We have Ash Grove Cement near Helena, and there's another one out, I believe, near Three Forks. And those facilities account for about 3%, 2 or 3% of emissions in Montana. We had an aluminum smelter that also used fossil fuels on site that closed in 2009 up in Columbia Falls. And then steel manufacturing is a big industry, but not in Montana. So we are not looking at how to decarbonize that in this state. And then finally, our residential and commercial heating and cooking. So like I mentioned, there's direct methane gas hookups to a lot of buildings for heating and cooking. That's used in stovetops, it's used in boilers for water and also for space heating. And there's opportunities to swap those out for heat pumps are great for heating. They can work for both water and space. And what they do basically is move heat around using electricity. It's highly efficient. Normal or traditional methane gas or even electric heating applications have to use a lot of energy to heat up air. But what's great about heat pumps is that they just move the heat around. So it's a lot more efficient. And there's some cool applications of those, whether it's energy districts where you share heat energy between neighboring buildings, or geothermal batteries where you store that underground using the ambient temperature of the earth for storage. So there's a lot of opportunities in heating, and there's also in cooking. Instead of methane stoves, you can use electric induction stoves. And those are great because they still have a lot of the performance features that you'd want with your stove, but you don't have the climate impacts, but also the health impacts of having burning gas in your home. And we're learning a lot more about all the pollution associated with that. And I'm going to circle back here to the IRA, and here's some of the funding available here. And I believe also there's an additional program that I saw might be rolling out this year for specifically electric stove replacement. So be on the lookout for that, for rebates and tax credits. And like I mentioned, there's hard to abate sectors. So in industry, there's often specialized high intensity energy use. This is a graphic from a petroleum refinery, and just how there's a lot of heating elements to kind of parse out the different pieces of crude oil. And you have to reach really high temperatures that can be challenging with electricity, but there's kind of burgeoning technologies for that, and also some other opportunities. but that is still an energy use that can be decarbonized. And then another hard to abate thing that starts to get out of energy, but when we talk about cement, there's both energy elements, but also chemical elements to the emissions. So there's going to be a kiln that does burn fossil fuels on site, and we can find ways to decarbonize that heating process, but also the calcination of the product just in itself releases carbon dioxide. So that's beyond energy, but also something that needs to be considered. And when we are talking about these things that are going to be challenging to electrify, there's also other opportunities for carbon-free fuels. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen, and I'll talk a little more about that, but making sure that if we are looking to alternative fuels, it's really we're paying attention to the impacts of those fuels and making sure that they are actually clean. So this next piece is going to be demand side management and efficiencies. So where this comes into play is as we are electrifying all these different pieces of energy that currently use fossil fuels as an end use, there's going to be an increase to the overall demand on our electricity system. And there will be a need to build out a lot more generation capacity, but there's also opportunities to bring down that demand using these tools that are available to us. So I mentioned that there's the strain of further electrifying all our energy uses, but there's also just a trend of increased energy consumption. And that's something that efficiencies and other things can continue to curtail, but we do want to look at how specifically we can achieve those efficiencies. And here are those graphics I showed earlier, and you'll notice the graphic on the right that's showing the projection for 2050 includes a dramatic increase in overall energy use, and that's going to be achieved by these efficiency measures and other related tools. So first off, talking about what these efficiencies look like, starting with household appliances, you can look to Energy Star as a great rating system that will just certify that appliances that you use in your home, be that washer machines, dishwashers, dryers, refrigerators, any appliances that plug in on your countertop, that those are going to be as efficient as they can be. And that's going to save both energy use, but also save money at the end of the day on your electricity bills. Another common one is lighting, and we see just that LED lights are just far more efficient than previous alternatives. And then insulation, this comes in a number of forms. There's walls and roofs, but also easier to address can be your doors and making sure that they're not leaking and have good insulation, and also windows, making sure you have insulating windows of double or triple pane that can create really hold in the energy, so you don't have to continue pumping energy into your home just to keep it warm when you can just hold it at that temperature through efficiencies. And then the last point I wanted to mention with efficiencies is kind of more on a macro scale, thinking about how we design our communities and our cities to be more efficient, to require less transportation, to be more walkable and have more connection with public transportation options. So overall, we're just going to be using less electricity. And I'm going to, I believe, loop back. There's also IRA rebates and tax credits for efficiencies. So I'd encourage you to look into those. And then getting into demand side management, this is more on the utility side of things. And these are strategies to disincentivize electricity use during peak periods. And there's a couple ways you can do this through kind of dynamic real-time pricing. You can just have less electricity used in peak use periods. Oftentimes that's going to be the evenings, but there's also curtailment service that utilities can offer to larger customers. An example of one that this would work for is crypto mining outfits that use a really large amount of electricity. And what utilities can do is have a contract where during these really high peak events, they can agree to not draw power for those times and curtail their use, because that's going to be non-essential electricity use. So instead of building out a bunch of generation infrastructure to meet that peak period, we can just level out the demand. And I have a graphic here showing a couple of these strategies. And the main things, we have load shifting and peak shaving. So you can either move when that energy is used, as you can see on the left, where the peaks kind of go into the lower use periods, or you can just curtail and shave the highest peaks so that you are using less energy overall. But both of those achieve the same thing, where at the end of the day, there's a lower peak demand on the electricity system. And a final note on demand reduction, efficiency from the energy transition. If we, as we swap the current fossil fuel intensive infrastructure for carbon-free renewables, there's also energy savings from just the fact that we're no longer needing fuels. All our fossil fuel electricity generation requires coal or gas or sometimes petroleum. But when we switch to renewables, there's not any fuels, there's natural processes that keep those running. So all the energy that currently goes into producing these fossil fuels is no longer needed, and all of the energy we generate can be used for what we need it in the end. And another point here is just that as we are generating more distributed, using distributed energy sources, if we have rooftop solar is the main example of that, we are going to be using that electricity near where it is produced in our homes. And there's additional savings to be achieved just from not having to transmit that electricity over long power lines that will lose some of it. So the next piece here is electricity decarbonization. So I talked about making the energy we use all electric, and then reducing the overall demand we have on that system. But then to really decarbonize the electricity we're using, we need to look specifically at our generation infrastructure. And the main things we're going to be talking about here are wind and solar and storage. There's other pieces, but we really have to be mindful of how we're doing this and how we're transitioning from the current fossil fuels we have. And a big part of that is how we're bringing our communities along that have been historically dependent on these fossil fuels. A big example of this is the Colstrip community out in eastern Montana that is supported by the Colstrip power plant. It's the largest point polluter in Montana, a coal power plant. And there's already some funds. They have not been used, but Puget Sound Energy and Avista have contributed to that. There are some of the joint owners, utilities that own part of that plant. And then also federally, there's some money available to help with the community transition, economic transition, and retraining of the workforce. So we need to keep investing in opportunities like this, and also be mindful and bring these people along. And I want to note that while there's funds available for Colstrip, there's other communities in Montana that we also have to be supportive of. There's the Crow Reservation has Absaloka mine on their land, and then the Roundup community has Signal Peak mine, and all these different fossil fuel dependent communities we need to bring along. And I wanted to note the state of Colorado, as well as state of Michigan, have recently implemented these Just Transition Office, or Office of Worker and Community Economic Transition. And that's something that is in a part of the state, an office that we could create here in Montana. And at MEIC, we've previously brought that to the legislature and tried to have the PSC, Public Service Commission, help with these transitions, but something that we'll continue to pay attention to as opportunities to really guide these communities along. So when we're talking about switching over these underlying pieces of the energy system, I talked about the aspect of these affected communities as we decommission fossil fuel plants, but there's also a couple other pieces as we take these offline. Here you see that's the Colstrip plant. And another big thing to consider is the financial implications for these utilities that need to stay financially viable and make money to keep running and keep providing electricity to Montana. So I'm not going to get into the weeds of this, but MEIC with worked really close with Denise Heyman, a legislator, to pass securitization in the 2019 legislature that creates a funding mechanism that allows utilities to refinance debt on potentially stranded generation assets, such as these fossil fuel plants, so that they can reinvest that money where it's needed in renewables and make that transformation. And then this other piece is just making sure that as we take these offline, they have been providing a service to the electric grid and Montanans in creating electricity. And we have to make sure that we are supporting the grid and replacing that lost generation capacity with carbon-free sources. So this graphic is the recently released generation portfolio for Northwestern Energy in Montana from 2023. We see that 58% is carbon-free, and we're lucky to have access to a lot of hydro that's been around in Montana for a lot longer than Northwestern has. But we also see that there's still a long ways to go. There's a lot of wind developed, but there's really so much more that we can be tapping into in Montana. And we would like to see just so much more of that built out. There's solar opportunities and opportunities to build that out even more. And what we really are lacking is any amount of storage infrastructure in the state. And that's really going to help with these variable resources, the wind and solar, and being able to capture that energy when it's available and be able to dispatch it when it's needed. And that's going to be really key to filling out this whole pie chart with our carbon-free energy. And another piece there is there are opportunities on our existing hydro resources to retrofit and upgrade the generation turbines so they can keep generating more electricity for us. And I want to touch on some technologies that enable this transition. There are definitely a lot of people that are nervous about switching the way we've been running our electric grid to this new way that is just going to be different. It's doable, but it's not the same that we've been doing for the last many decades. So there's a number of technologies that can help that along as we are shifting our paradigm from these large centralized generating thermal assets that use coal and gas to kind of establish the grid to more having these renewables everywhere, but also there's this opportunity for distributed energy resources. And those are just going to be things like rooftop solar or home batteries that are really distributed and not centralized in any way. And I believe here there's also a number of incentives for building out your own distributed energy resources. Solar is an especially accessible one, but these are just our IRA funding again. And another cool thing that we start to be able to access with DERs is virtual power plants, which is just a coordination of all these different resources to dispatch energy between batteries, between households, and really run a dynamic grid in a way that we're able to in the 21st century. Another point I want to get at is a big sticking point for a lot of people that manage the grid is that we rely on these large generation assets to form the grid. There's a lot of stability that's provided by large spinning turbines at coal plants, but also at hydroelectric sites. And those establish the stability that we need on a grid. And traditionally, renewable energy sources just follow that stability. But there's also technology available called grid forming inverters that just allows these renewable and other sources to create that stability themselves on the grid and establish all the functions that are needed. And these are used in island grids, specifically some applications in Hawaii and continuing to develop there, but there's opportunities and it's been a shown technology. And all of this just kind of fits into a more modern way of managing the electric grid, given what's available to us today. This next piece I'm going to talk about, the next two really are pretty interrelated, but transmission infrastructure is going to be key to having decarbonized electricity. It's one thing to be able to generate these resources. In Montana, we have wind that can power our needs, but also can be shared to the region for their own energy needs. But the constraint, a large constraint there, is the ability to get that power from where it can be generated to where it's needed. And that's where transmission comes in. And this is another graphic provided by the New York Times in that same article, but it's showing on the left that current transmission capacity as we have in 2020 in the United States. And then on the right is showing the amount that would be needed in 2035 to facilitate the amount of renewable energy generation that is needed to decarbonize our electric grid. So there's a long way to go, but there's also a lot of national attention to this issue right now. And another graphic here, this just shows that we're constricted by the current amount of transmission we have. There's these interconnection queues where proposed projects, for a number of reasons, have not been developed yet. And a large part of that is there's just not the ability to connect them to the grid. And we see just so much solar, wind, and storage proposals. These are in gigawatts. We, in a household, would use a kilowatt. So this is a much larger unit, but just showing that transmission is really important to be able to unlock this renewable carbon-free potential. And just want to touch on what some of these roadblocks are. One big thing is just educating communities that are impacted and being able to work with communities so that building out new transmission can be a joint effort and not adversarial. And that can be a real challenge. And there's also this challenge of interstate coordination where these transmission lines are national, they are kind of between states, and who is going to take the lead on that? How do different states work together? And another big piece of that is who is going to pay for them. And that's a big issue we see with the Bonneville Power Administration, BPA, in the Northwest, of just needing to build these projects, but how are you going to recover the cost? Who's going to pay? And all this, along with permitting, can make it a really lengthy process and challenging to expand our transmission. But while we're thinking about these kind of bigger projects, there's also projects we can be working on currently to really bolster the amount of energy that can move through the current electric infrastructure. A big one of these is reconductoring. That's swapping out the lines that are on these big transmission systems just so they can move more electricity at a given time. And there's a lot of benefits that can be gained from this. And we're really hoping that this continues to be a big focus. And another piece here is this idea of grid enhancing technologies. There's a lot of things that might fit into this, and it's something that's really been picked up in Europe for over a decade now, but just more advanced ways to monitor and manage how we're moving electricity through the grid. A big part of that is just being able to understand the temperature of a line on a given time, because a lot of limitation is placed on how much energy can move through the transmission system based on extreme events and how much electricity would overheat the system. But if you know at a given time the temperature of the lines, you can shift the amount of power you're moving. And during events, if the wind is blowing, you'll have cooler lines and you can move more power. And there's other lots of pieces there that you can keep getting more out of the infrastructure we already have, and that's really cost effective. And the final piece for transmission opportunities, and I'm going to get more into power sharing and some pieces of that, but a regional transmission authority, there's one of these in Colorado as well as New Mexico, which is just a state body that can really help to coordinate this process and streamline to build out the transmission capacity that is going to be needed in this energy transition. So now we're on this last piece of the puzzle, regional power sharing, and this goes really closely in with transmission infrastructure, just that we are going to be moving electricity from where it is available to where it is needed. And that's kind of a reciprocal relationship between neighboring states, neighboring communities, so that we can use these renewable energy resources where they're available for the communities that they're needed in. And just going to show quickly, this is the current regional transmission organization map of the United States. You can see that there are these organizations that coordinate regionally of how power is moved in the United States, but a big gap here is the West, and Montana is mostly excluded from this, as well as the South. And this is something that we've been paying a lot of attention to and would like to see Montana also become part of a regional organization like this. And this is currently the Northwest. There is pretty piecemeal management of who is balancing the electricity generation and use. And it's mostly just these different utilities that are running these areas. But what's exciting is there is momentum in this space of markets of moving power to from where it is available to where it can be used. Currently, Northwestern Energy is a part of the Western Energy Imbalance Market. They joined in 2021. This has been around since 2014. And while this is limited in functionality, it's only these utilities are trading power an hour ahead so they can meet real-time energy needs. But there's a lot of limitations in price volatility when you're only being able to trade your power an hour in advance. But even with those limitations, we've already seen tremendous benefits, over 5 billion total benefits of the entire system. But of that, Northwestern Energy has already seen nearly $75 million in benefits since joining in 2021. So we see that there's already these economic benefits of being able to share power and not needing to meet every second of your state's energy demand with generation infrastructure in the state. And that goes both ways. We both buy and sell electricity depending on what's available and what the weather is doing, where the sun is shining, and all these different factors. So there's kind of a few steps of progression here. The next step from the energy imbalance market would be the energy day ahead market, EDAM, and that's something that's been approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and we're hoping that really soon utilities will be able to start joining that, and that provides additional functionality in that you trade energy up to the day ahead. So you can look at the weather forecast and figure out what the demand is going to be, what generation capacity you're going to have available, and be able to more optimally conduct that sharing, and also that'll help to keep prices down. And the logical final evolution of this would be a regional transmission organization or an independent system operator that can both coordinate energy markets, but also that transmission component. So we are able to effectively move energy around from where it is generated to where it is needed. So that's the main pieces of this energy transition. There's a couple kind of loose ends that I want to touch on, and all these things have so many different threads that you can pull on and get a whole rat's nest. So lots to talk about, but one thing I want to touch on is a few kind of things in the public discourse that would be good to get the record straight. And the first point of this is carbon capture and storage, CCS. There's a lot of people talking about using CCS as a way to keep these fossil fuel plants running. And I want to make a distinction between carbon capture and storage and carbon removal. And there is likely going to be some degree of needed carbon removal from the atmosphere to be able to truly address the climate crisis and reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. But it's different to remove carbon directly from the atmosphere than to capture it from a polluting source. You're not going to capture all of it, and it's going to be really energy and cost intensive. So there's a lot to be developed there, but still a lot of drawbacks. And specifically, I wanted to highlight Colstrip. There is a study done in 2018 that included just looking into what carbon capture and storage would cost. The initial investment was 1.3 billion. There is 100 million annual operating costs, and that's only to capture 63% of the emissions of the plant. And that's going to reduce the efficiency of the plant itself. It's not going to generate as much electricity, and of an already aging and expensive plant, it's just going to add so much cost. So really important to debunk the idea of carbon capture and storage as a way to keep these fossil fuel plants running. Another thing just to be wary of and keep aware of is hydrogen. There's, like we talked about in the hard to abate sectors, there's very good likelihood that it'll be some part of the final solution, but it shouldn't be considered a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all our problems, and it must really be clean. You'll hear there's all these different colors that represent how the hydrogen is produced. And a lot of those involve fossil fuels and have their own emissions associated with them. And green hydrogen is going to be the only truly clean one. We want to make sure that there's really stringent kind of regulation around that, so that when we are developing a hydrogen economy, as we do that, it is clean. And it's important to understand that generating clean hydrogen, it's using electrolysis from electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And that is energy intensive. And you want to make sure that that energy is coming from clean sources, that we're not overburdening the energy system as it is. So it's not going to be viable in all applications. And then the final thing, and I'm not going to talk too much about nuclear, but we have been, myself and Ann Hedges, we've been traveling to some different communities to talk about where we're at with nuclear energy in Montana and the challenges there. We have another event coming up. It's our final one in Great Falls on Monday. So if you're around, there will be more information about that. But the big takeaways there is that it's just really an expensive and risky and unproven technology. It's not something that's viable today to solve the climate crisis in an affordable and timely way that we need in this pressing issue. And then finally, just some opportunities to pay attention to. We do have most of this technology available to us, but there's no reason to hesitate to start the work in this transition. And really, we are well underway. We've seen the pace of renewable clean energy development just far outpacing fossil fuel development. And that's really, the transition is happening right under us. But some pieces that are going to have to continue developing to get to the end here and fully decarbonize energy. A big one is going to be our energy storage. And there's a lot of utility investment in short-term storage. That's going to be in the 2 to 8 hour range. Relatively 4, I believe, is pretty standard. But we also are going to need more opportunities for long duration battery storage that allows us to capture energy when it's available in the wind and the sun and other ways, and be able to redispatch it and hold on to it for a longer amount of time. And the other thing I mentioned in industries that you need to achieve really high temperatures, and being able to achieve that with electricity, there's some developments on industrial battery storage that can specifically reach those temperatures. And then some other things just to keep an eye on that could be a part of this equation going forward. Enhanced geothermal is a technology that I believe the first kind of proof of concept project came online pretty recently, of just being able to cost effectively tap into a geothermal resource in a lot of places where historically we haven't been able to. So that becomes viable. That might be a part of the equation. I've talked about clean hydrogen, and it's yet to be seen how much of a role that's going to play. And I will mention fusion is a technology. You may have heard of some recent breakthroughs in being able to achieve fusion ignition and generate electricity in that way. But I would just note that while there's been advancements, it's still going to be decades out at the soonest to be economically viable at utility scale. And that's just something that maybe we'll keep our hopes out that will be part of the equation down the road, but it's not going to be a big factor in addressing climate change immediately. And there's, of course, all these other pieces that we can never know of technological advancement that might contribute. So that's all of that. And I wanted to touch on just briefly here what we've been working on more recently with addressing climate change in our energy system, decarbonizing our energy and working on this energy transition, and mentioned the rulemaking petition that we filed yesterday with over 40 partners in this joint petition. But we're really excited at that prospect. We have approached the Public Service Commission to consider climate impacts of the utilities it regulates in its decision-making. And we're really hopeful that this could be a catalyst to really change the energy conversation in Montana and get our Public Service Commission to steer Northwestern Energy in the right direction to decarbonize energy. And here I think I just have all those petitioners. It's a great group of partners, and we're really happy to have all of these groups. And with that, I will open it up to questions. There's so many things.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nick. Feel free to raise your hands and I'll unmute you so you can ask questions. I'm going to call back to a question I saw a little bit ago in the chat from Mary Ann Dunwell, who is wanting to know more about the possibility of geothermal power generation, not just geothermal storage.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe, I'm not sure where that lined up in the presentation, but definitely right now, the geothermal power generation that's available is very much determined by what's happening geologically in an area. So it's pretty, I think California has a lot of that, but there's only a certain number of states that have that. I think Iceland really has a lot of that just based on the activity that's happening under the ground there. But what is exciting about enhanced geothermal is it just opens the geographic opportunity of where you might be able to capture heat and generate electricity from the heat in the ground. And there's exciting developments to come, so we'll be paying attention.
Great. Mary Ann?
Hi, yes, thank you very much. And thanks for this great presentation. Oh my gosh. I'm a state legislator, and it really helps me get the wheels turning about, legislation development and how and what to talk to my colleagues, especially the ones that you have to kind of nudge along. I do have a follow-up, please, about geothermal. It just seems to me it's all around us here in Montana, just like the wind and solar, but geothermal, I mean, it's everywhere. Yellowstone hot spring and all the hot springs we have around. It just seems like a natural resource. And I've been reading a little bit that this is in order to nudge some of my colleagues along to believe in renewable energy, but you could kind of transition oil and gas and the methods of extraction of oil and gas and the people who work on that to geothermal. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate some on that too. And this is for legislation development for the next session, fingers crossed, if not subsequent sessions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess I would point to the reason that we've seen these breakthroughs recently in enhanced geothermal is because they are applying what's been learned in really the oil and gas industries and borrowing some of the insights that have been gained from drilling and even from fracking and being able to take those kind of damaging technologies and use them in a way that allows you to drill for geothermal energy sources. And it's definitely a big opportunity, and there's opportunities to use the workforce that already has these skills. I think that'd be great. It's definitely something to consider of where you're doing it. I know like Yellowstone National Park, while it has all of this geothermal potential, would not be a great place to build a geothermal plant because we want to preserve that as a national park that it is. But yeah, definitely something worth looking into.
Mary Ann, do you have another follow-up? I'll have to unmute you. Sorry. We've heard some rumors of Zoom bombing, so I'll just see if you have another follow-up.
No, I do. I appreciate that insight. Something I hadn't thought about, that we wouldn't want to, destroy the pristine nature of the Yellowstone Park and its environs. So that's good to know. That's something to consider. So I look forward to working with MEIC on this because I think this is something that more than nuclear can maybe convince some of the folks who in the past have needed some treats to move along towards renewable. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. We'll get a question from Rio.
Yeah, hi. So I actually work for a renewable energy developer, and I'm running for the state legislature. So I'm very interested in this topic, obviously. I have a couple questions. I'll start with one. I see, and this will kind of piggyback off the one in the chat. But what kind of policy changes would you see and recommend that would best incentivize utility to start making some of these changes? Renewable energy portfolio, do we need to remove the capital investment as the only source of profit for the utility to encourage them? What sort of policy, as I start to think about this, hopefully, I'm curious what your perspective on that would be.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different angles that you could take. I know when we're talking about maybe smaller renewable development, distributed energy resources, there's just limits on net metering. There's the opportunity for community solar. That would be a great piece of legislation to open more opportunities to have this clean energy. And yeah, those are some big things that come to mind. I think also legislation around transmission, creating a Montana Transmission Authority. Like I mentioned, Colorado and New Mexico have those. That's something that could help coordinate transmission expansion in the state, and that would be a legislative action, as well as creating that office of workforce transition for these affected communities. And then there's definitely a number of different opportunities, and I'm sure as we head into the legislative session, we'll spend a lot more time thinking about what we can work on. But Anne, if you have any additional thoughts, you're welcome to chime in as well.
It is exactly why, thank you, Nick. It's exactly why we filed the petition for rulemaking yesterday with the Public Service Commission, because there is no entity in the state that makes more consequential decisions regarding renewable energy and fossil fuels for this state than the Public Service Commission. They are the ones who help Northwestern keep renewable energy developers from being able to get contracts with the utilities. They are the ones who decide on whether Northwestern can rate base things like the Yellowstone generating station, the methane gas plant on the banks of the Yellowstone. They are the ones who are going to have to approve Northwestern passing on costs for an additional share of Colstrip. These are the biggest fossil fuel polluting sources that we have in the state or will have in the state. And the fact that our Public Service Commission can't consider climate change in its decision making on whether or not to rate base or to regulate the utility is counter to the Constitution. It's counter to good, sound economics. It is the driving force right now behind not getting more renewable energy off the ground and allowing our utility to invest more in fossil fuels. So I think the rulemaking petition that was just filed, that we have 60 days for the public to comment on, is probably the most important step in the right direction. There are a lot of legislative changes we would like to see. That is going to be more difficult, considering the composition of the legislature. But the rulemaking petition is done under existing statute, and it is done under our constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. So I think that that's right there.
Amen.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I put a link in the chat where you can send a message to the PSC saying you support this official petition. You also can go to PSC meetings at 9:30 on Monday morning or Tuesday mornings. Tuesday mornings. If you're in person, you can just be there to submit comment. But if you want to comment via Zoom or phone, I think you have to do that by 4:30 the day before. You have to let them know either by phone or email. And that information will all go out in our action alert on Monday, but there are ways that you can add your voice to that petition as individuals that would be really helpful. So we're at 5:30, but we have a couple more questions that hopefully we can get some input on. One question from Mary Catherine is about the limit on net metering in Montana and how can we get that increased? That's a tough nut to crack.
That's a great question. And I guess I'd welcome other input on the best way to go about that. But I mean, the Public Service Commission, Northwestern Energy, I don't know if is that going to be at the legislature?
Let's ask McKenna.
Yeah.
McKenna, are you still there?
I gotta let McKenna unmute. Sorry, I gotta hunt her name down
Okay.
in there she is.
There we are. Can you all
McKenna-
hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Hi, everybody. McKenna Sellers, Executive Director for the Montana Renewable Energy Association. Thank you, MEIC. Thank you, Nick, for putting on this excellent presentation. And it was really comprehensive. I think it's got our brains churning, and that's the whole point. But in answer to that question with net metering, at least in IOU service territory, that 50 kW limit for net metered systems is in state statute. So it's in the MCA. It would have to be a legislative adjustment if we were to change it. And that 50 kW cap has been around since net metering was passed in 1999. And as you might guess, a lot has changed in the solar industry since 1999. So we've made a number of attempts to make adjustments to that net metering cap because it is limiting for schools, libraries, and larger users that would go and exceed that 50 kW capacity limit. For example, we just got back from a conference in Colorado. They still have their net metering is in some net metering talks now. Their penetration levels are a lot higher than Montana's. They're sitting at about 7.5% with their net metered customers, where Montana is, I just was looking at this data, 0.75% for Northwestern's customers, at least, that are net metered, so 0.75%. So anyway, we have a number of strategies that we have worked through, and I think what it's going to take is the political will of lawmakers to follow along on the emphasis on distributed energy being an option for Montanans.
Thanks, McKenna, for jumping in there on the spot. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, McKenna. We have one more question that we haven't answered in the chat, but I imagine it's going to ring a little bit of the same. Any thoughts about promoting the energy transition in our towns and cities? Some cities seem to get it, while others ...
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the petition. You heard a lot about that from Anne. There's lots of opportunities for communities across the state to engage in that. There's the issue of net metering, but just building out your own distributed energy resources in your communities and having your municipal governments support that renewable transition. And there's a lot of ways, both locally and as well as just influencing the state legislators, that you can continue to engage.
And I would say if anybody has the ability, interest in mimicking what Climate Smart Missoula has done in other communities, that's really what we need to do to move our cities and counties off their dots. Particularly, I'm in Helena, and we are pathetic. We have a resolution that we have no plan to actually meet, and no interest in creating a plan to actually meet. So we have been spinning our wheels in Helena, as Mark, you know, for many, many years. And I just see the great work of Climate Smart Missoula and Amy's team there. And I think if we could have one of those in every community, we may not need the state because they really have been incredibly effective and technical. So I think it's just going to be a lot of kind of boot leather type work.
Yeah, definitely some good discussion going on in the chat. I hate to cut it short, but we are a little bit over time, and we really appreciate you all spending that time with us tonight. We're glad to have Nick. We'll have more of these conversations. Transmission and transition are really big issues for us. So please continue sending us your ideas, come to our events, let's have more of these discussions.
And thank you all for being here.